Continuing our discussion on management of quality, we need to discuss certain quality principles in product development. And there are several types of quality principles you should be aware of during the product development stage. Three important the principles I am going to discuss now. The first one is the concept of extended process, customer driven improvement cycle, and the principles of supplier selection. So these are the three important principles. Now, it has always been emphasized by the management practitioners and the researchers alike that the commitment of management towards fulfillment of quality goal at all stages of product development is key to organizational success. This point or this issue we have been emphasizing all the time. That means the commitment of management is very, very vital. It has assumed significance in the current fiercely competitive business environment for almost all types of products. And in order to fulfill the quality goals, you have no other alternative but to apply certain number of principles related to many aspects of quality control, improvement and management. Essentially, we have three important aspects. First one is the quality control, second one is the quality improvement, and then you definitely emphasize on quality management. It must be a constant endeavor on the part of any management to take effective steps to implement these principles. It is obvious, so you should be aware of that in which context these principles are relevant. Now, these principles which we are going to discuss, these principles are general in nature, and as they are general in nature, they are applicable in all types of organizations, in almost all situations or conditions. Now, related to product development process, it is essential that on the part of management of an organization to verify whether they are being followed at any stage of product development. This is very, very vital. Otherwise, as we are aware that if the product development process is not effective or efficient, the company has to pay a heavy price for this one. So we cannot afford to ignore all these relevant and important principles during product development stage. A number of benefits such as reduced cost, faster development of products, higher competitiveness of products, and long sustainability of the products and processes, so a company may have with the application of these principles. So these are the benefits, and without having these benefits, the company's sustainability will be at stake. Now, briefing all these aspects that why these quality principles are required to be used or to be followed in product development process, three important principles I am going to discuss. First one is the concept of extended process. The second one is the customer driven improvement cycle. What is that? What are the elements in this improvement cycle? And the principles of supplier selection. So let us talk about the extended process. What is this extended process? Now, this concept was initially proposed by W.E. Deming. Okay, he is considered to be one of the quality gurus, and this extended process consists of not only the processes and employees of an organization, but also other components which are directly influencing the performance of the organization. So these components are outside the traditional domain and control of the organization. As the meaning is very clear, when you look at an organization, we talk about its employees, we talk about its processes. But you need to consider, along with these two components, you need to consider some other the components also which essentially which are lying outside the domain and control of the organization. A typical extended process includes the components, 4 components we have, 5 including the community. Essentially there are 4 components like customers, the suppliers, shareholders and investors, and the community and the environment. So these are all these 5 components must be part of the extended process. Now let us just highlight certain points in this context. An organization consists of persons, machines or facilities, materials, methods and capital or the money. These elements are considered within the boundary of an organization. This is very, very clear. Everybody knows about it. But the extended process includes a number of key components that come from the system external to the organization. So this we must look into. That means what are those the components. They are existing outside of the organizational domain, but they are significantly impacting or influencing the performance of an organization. So among these components, customers or the consumers are the most important. It is obvious. Satisfaction of customer is the primary goal of any organization, whether it is a product or service producing type. So customer, we have to consider the interest of the customers. Goals such as providing the investors with an acceptable rate of return are secondary. So obviously the investors will be there, and we need to assure that that acceptable rate of return they are eligible to obtain. Achieving the primary goal, that is the customer satisfaction, automatically causes secondary goals to be realized. That means if the customer is satisfied, more number of units you can sell, your revenue will increase, your financial performance will be better, and obviously the investors will be getting a high or acceptable rate of return on the investment which they have made. The community in which the organization operates should be considered in this extended process. That means the people at large who are directly or indirectly getting influenced by the company's activities or organizational performance. This community includes consumers, employees and anyone else who is influenced by the operations of the company directly or indirectly. This point already made. Suppliers are another component of the extended process, and they play a very vital role. For most products, the majority of the component parts and raw materials required for a product need to be procured from outside of the suppliers. When you start collecting data on these aspects, you will find that almost the 40 to 70% of the items listed in any bill of material for a product are actually you have to procure from outside, that means from the suppliers. Many a time as high as 80% of the parts or components are to be purchased from the suppliers. So this point is to be noted, and quality of the product is very much dependent on the quality of the supplied parts and the components hence, and efforts must be made to ensure that the suppliers supply quality parts and components all the time. Is it okay? So this is obvious, and the supplier's quality will directly influence the product quality. A long-standing relationship between the suppliers and the organization is what is called for, so that the organization has the maximum benefit in terms of lowered cost and improved service. So what we were asking for, a long-standing relationship between the company and the suppliers. So what are the components of the extended process? We have the environment is affecting company's performance, the shareholders or the investors, they're directly responsible for investment required for the company's sustainability, and then the customers, they're getting their products, and they are the basically the consumers of the products. Then the suppliers, they are directly the controlling the production systems in supplying the items or the components or the raw materials required for carrying out the production system, and obviously the community as large. Is it okay? Now, the next important the principles I am going to discuss, that is the improvement cycle. And we always say that this improvement cycle is for the customer. So that's why sometimes it is referred to as the customer driven improvement cycle. Now let us highlight the important aspects in this improvement cycle. In the present day business and industrial environment, strategic goal of an organization should be based on the requirements and expectations of the customers out of its products and services being offered. That means whether by offering the products and services to the customers, whether you are able to fulfill the requirements and expectation of the customer. That is the key, and the strategic management or the top management of an organizations, they are always concerned about this aspect. The customers are the driving force in formulating and pursuing the strategic goal. It is obvious, and this customer driven approach ensures a better and faster product improvement cycle. So there are the few elements. There are 4 specific elements in this improvement cycle. Let me explain briefly each of these elements. In element 1, the product is designed based on current and anticipated future customer needs. So whenever we talk about product design, absolutely it is based on to what extent you can fulfill, or the design is able to fulfill the customer needs and the requirements. Obviously, an attempt to include these needs as far as possible will have a bearing on the product quality and cost. Sometimes you go for under design, sometimes you may go for over design. So both are not allowed. So what actually you have to do, that means you create the product design in such a way that at a given point in time the customer requirements are exactly fulfilled. So these aspects we talk about in element 1. In the next element, element 2, the product is manufactured and tested in the laboratory in order to ascertain to what extent the actual quality of the product conforms to its designated quality, and if the product can be sold with the actual quality level. That means experimentation you have to do, and it must be conducted within your control and with your conditions, and these conditions you specify as based on the customer requirements. In the next element, element 3, the product needs to be sold with the expectation that the majority of the customers be satisfied with the present design. Once the product is sold, its ownership gets changed and the customers start using it. So this is it is obvious, in fact. That means you produce the product and you send it to the customers, the ownership gets changed, and then you check that whether the customer expectation is really fulfilled or not. In the next element, that is element 4, the quality of performance is judged through market research, and improvement in design, if needed, is achieved through incorporation of relevant changes or modifications in the design parameters for products and processes, because the customer expectations are changing, and so also the design levels. Is it okay? So you have to keep on improving the design level so that current and future customer requirements getting fulfilled. This leads to improved customer satisfaction in the next cycle of product quality improvement. So there is a cycle, and it is when the closed loop. So you have product design, then you go for product manufacture and testing, and then you go for product selling, and then obviously you are evaluating the product performance, and based on your evaluation of product performance, again you may go for a change in the product design. So this cycle continues. Okay, so this is referred to as the product improvement cycle. Now the next one I am going to discuss, that is what are the principles you should apply while you go for supplier selection. Now it's an important activity, supplier selection, and if supplier selection is improper, ultimately what you will find that many of the components may not be of which you are going to receive from the suppliers, they may not be of acceptable quality, and ultimately, if you use those inferior quality the components and parts being supplied by the suppliers or the vendors, ultimately the quality of the final product will be affected. So selection of the supplier is very, very important, and while you select the supplier, certain principles you have to follow or you have to adopt. So selection of suppliers for its parts, components and raw materials is a responsibility of management of an organization. Many a time management is required to change the process through which the supplier selection is conducted at present. That means each company, each organization has its the purchasing policy, has its purchasing procedures and the purchasing cycle, the kinds of methods or the kinds of procedures you apply depending on the type of item you are going to procure from the suppliers. So there could be institutional purchasing, there could be capital equipment purchasing, there could be raw materials purchasing, but the different types of the purchasing systems you may have, but whatever may be the purchasing system or the purchasing procedure, certain principles you have to follow. So the gap between the supplier and the buyer must be narrowed down. That means you have certain expectation as a buyer, and the supplier is trying to fulfill your expectations. So whether there is a gap between these two, so this gap must be narrowed down as the as the time passes. They must work as a team to choose methods and materials that improve customer satisfaction. That means when you look at the organization as an extended process, obviously we never say that the supplier is existing outside of the company. So it's a part of the system, is a part of the organizational systems. So it is expected that the customer and the supplier they work closely. So in selecting a supplier, the total cost, which includes the first cost of purchase, this is the point to be noted. Many a time this is ignored. The first cost of purchase plus the cost to put the material into production. That means the first cost of purchase versus the total cost of purchase. So when you consider the cost to put the material into production and what sort of difficulties you may be getting when you use a particular material in a process, so there is a cost associated with it. So always you have to take a decision whether you will go by the first cost of purchase or you will go by the total cost of purchase. Obviously you must have a mechanism in your system with which you are able to estimate the total cost of purchase. Okay, so this is very, very important while you select a particular supplier. Next important principle relates to knowing whether a product satisfied certain specification is not enough. They must understand the precise problems encountered with the purchase material. This is very, very important as it moves through the extended process of manufacture, assembly and eventual shipment to the consumer. That means what is required, that means the item may be supplied by a particular supplier, and now apparently that particular item conforming to the specifications, but it doesn't necessarily mean that even if the item conforms to the specifications, it may not create problems in maintaining quality in the manufacturing cycle or during assembly, or when you try to ship the product or you try to distribute the final product to the customers. So all sorts of problems related to a particular supply you must be aware of in the entire the cycle of shipping the product to the customer. The buyers must be familiar with the statistical methods so as to assess the quality of the supplier's plans. Obviously there will be variability in the supplier's items quality, and so you need to assess the level of variability, and that's why the statistical methods you need to use. Now they must be able to determine the degree of customer satisfaction with the products to specify what features are not liked by the customers, and to convey all related information to the supplier. This is very, very important. That means a thorough study is required of the product or the items which you are getting from the suppliers. Okay, so such information enables the suppliers to improve the quality of their products. So it's a continuous improvement in quality. So that philosophy the supplier must also believe in. Okay, so on these aspects, that means whether there is a variability in quality, so this information must be passed on to the suppliers. Another important principle involves reducing the number of suppliers. This is very, very important. The goal is to move toward single supplier items. What the companies have noticed, that for any item, suppose you go for a single supplier situation, a single supplier condition, you will find that you have no other alternative but to go for a long-standing relationship with the suppliers. So ultimately it pays off. Whereas the traditional practice had been that against a particular item, okay, you try to have more than one suppliers. The basic idea is that there is maybe some uncertainty in getting a particular say item from a given supplier. So you want to keep the alternative sources of supply. Okay, so this is the main reason, but this is the traditional approach. So the companies may have multiple suppliers for several reasons, we already know, including a fear of price increases, a supplier's inability to meet projected increases in demand, and its lack of timeliness in meeting the delivery schedules. That means so out of the total requirements, you say the 40% of the requirements will be supplied by the supplier A, remaining 40% by supplier B, and the rest 20% okay, of your requirements will be supplied by supplier C. So this is the traditional approach, and so there could be different disadvantages. Already the many companies they have been facing, and so like say feeling of mistrust between the buyer and the supplier, and the suppliers may not have any motivation to change their processes to meet the buyer specifications. Price, not quality, is the driving factor, because another supplier may be selected if its price is lower. So whenever you have multiple suppliers against a particular item, a long-term commitment cannot exist. And so obviously when you talk about the total cost of purchase in the long term, so what do you expect? That the total cost of purchase should come down over the time periods. But if you if entire the relationship between the supplier and the buyer is based on mistrust, so how can you have a sustainable purchase system? So the traditional approach, what we say, that the relationship between the supplier and the buyer is like the dog eat dog relationship. That means if you kill my dog, I will kill your cat. So that sort of situation, you must not create in any organizational the system. And what you go for say a single supply, or say the single supply case or single supplier system. That means sole supplying. So other disadvantages involve cost, increased paperwork if you have more number of suppliers, leads to increased order preparation cost, travel cost of the supplier to purchaser sites increase, volume discounts do not kick in because order sizes are smaller, obviously. That means the total requirement is split into several orders. So the order size against each supplier is expected to be very less. Obviously, you may not get say the discount or the price discount or the volume discount, whatever you say. So the order sizes are smaller when there is more than one supplier, and setup cost also go up because the buyer's process changes when the incoming supplier changes. And if you look into the throughput time of a given product in a particular manufacturing systems, so you must have adequate control on the setup time. So the setup time should be as minimum as possible, because if the setup time is more, setup cost will be more. So if you have a multiple the supplier system for a given product, obviously the setup cost is expected to be higher, and ultimately it will have a bearing on the total production cost. Okay. So what you need to do, that means the missing settings may have to be adjusted along with the tooling. And in continuous process industries, like in a chemical plant, such as the chemical companies producing sulfuric acid, differences in raw materials may require changes in the composition mix. So what is the assumptions that suppose you try to you get the materials or the raw materials from 3 specific suppliers, it is most likely that the quality of the raw material may vary from one supplier to another. And so obviously in a continuous process industries, if the raw materials quality vary, obviously what you have to do, that means you need to change the composition mix, okay, all the time. So this will have a bearing on the manufacturing throughput time or the process cycle time. Multiple setup periods mean idle production and therefore reduced capacity. So these are the the impact of the variability in the setup time. Training the people who work with the supplier cost more with multiple suppliers. So these are the the points you should look into, and that's why many companies these days they are trying to opt for a single supplier or single supplier based system. That means against each item what you try to do, you must select the best possible supplier, and then you continue with the practice of single supplier for each item. So there are many benefits, and as has been the experience of many well-known companies in this regard, the disadvantages as mentioned for multiple the supplier situation, these disadvantages, all these disadvantages which you have mentioned can be eliminated when a long-term relationship with a quality conscious supplier is developed. Okay, so with this basic introduction of say the principles of supplier selection, you may definitely relate that the quality of purchase system, to what extent it is affecting the quality of the product. That means whatever activities you carry out within purchasing system, now you need to look into that whether these activities are acceptable to you or not, and whether these activities are having adequate quality or not. So this must be branded as quality activities, and then only if you assure that the system is perfect, system is a quality system, whether it is for purchasing or for marketing, you will find it will have a significant bearing on the product quality as well as the process quality. So these are the 3 principles we have highlighted. In the next lecture session, I will be highlighting many more such principles which must be you must follow, or you must adhere to for management of quality. Thank you.